Welcome to a video where I, a 29-year-old guy sitting in his office/bedroom on a Monday, has decided that the most urgent contribution he can make to anti-capitalist theory is to critique a comedy show that stopped airing over 11 years ago. Now, first off, I really like this show. Parks and Rec is warm and lighthearted and shows how people can be friendly with each other despite their political differences. It's a delightful escape from the harsh reality of doing my dishes while people are suffering in the Middle East. I liked it, but that's actually why it's such a good example of propaganda. It's sneaky. I guess I'm just happy I caught it. If you've seen Parks and Rec, you know that there's this character in the office, Ron Swanson, who famously defines himself as a libertarian. He values personal freedom above all else and absolutely hates government intervention that would obstruct said freedom.
But here I come, the government.
But of course, we don't get too much into what he believes in beyond that. Any sort of critique we see is usually tied to his caricature of the American libertarian. And fair enough, this isn't really a show about social commentary, it's a comedy show, and the writers know that. And I should know that too. But then came this episode, Bailout, from the 5th season, and I just can't help myself. For whatever reason, the writers decided to give us an unusually straightforward take on the role of government, and on what they think about capitalism and the free market, and all that juicy stuff. And yes, those are all really big words that have many different meanings and definitions depending on if you're talking to Karl Marx or Ayn Rand. So I want to break it down and show you exactly why I think it's sneaky capitalist propaganda. Okay, so the whole setup of the episode is that there's this failing business. The Pawnee Video Dome is an art house cinema that rents out foreign films. But when the owner announces he's shutting down mid-screening of what sounds like a deeply depressing film, the other main character of the show, Leslie, is sitting in the audience. And Leslie, being a for-the-people city councilor, the ideological counter to Ron Swanson, well, she wants to fix it. So she brings in the owner to City Hall and proposes to make the Videodome into a historical landmark, which would give it a tax break and basically keep it afloat, and thus save the culture, save the community, and so on and so forth. But then comes our guy Ron, and he does not like that one bit.
That sounds like the government meddling in private enterprise.
Well, Ron, we all know how much you love the free market, but the Pawnee Videodome is the only place in town where people gather to do something intellectual.
And so it begins. Here we start to see the two ideological positions in battle. And in the beginning of this episode here, it's definitely also caricaturized just like it is throughout the rest of the show. What I mean is that the writers don't initially seem to openly favor any sort of specific ideological position. They keep it kind of satirized. For now, anyway.
This man is a failure.
No doubt.
He is not up to snuff.
Sure.
His business is failing and you're bailing it out. This is a bailout and I don't like it.
Yes, that's definitely true.
And there are some pretty intellectual conversations down at Barrett's Hardware.
Can't speak for that one, but generally Ron isn't wrong about any of this stuff. This very much is a government bailout, and Ron, being a free market kind of guy, really doesn't like it. And the Videodome clearly isn't bringing in enough money, let alone profiting, to keep it afloat. So yes, it is failing in that sense. But actually, that word is pretty loaded. Failure, I mean. Not to get all philosophical on you, but let's just think for a second about what it means to fail as a business. What does it mean to fail as a business? Does it A, mean the business isn't making enough money to stay afloat? B, the business isn't providing any sort of social benefit to the community or society? C, does a failing business mean making YouTube videos about capitalism on Parks and Rec? Or D, the number 1789? Yeah, I think I'm gonna go ahead and say C, the YouTube one. Of course you would. No, wait. I think I'm going to use my 50-50 on this one. Is it D? No. No, in our world, the answer is almost always A and not B. A business fails when the market has spoken. A business needs to make money to survive. I mean, you're not going to get a business loan from the private bank if your idea is to just hand out food to homeless people. I mean, that'd be great for the homeless people, but you're not going to make any money to pay back the loan like that. And of course, this is where our social system and our governments come into play to subsidize or even bail out financially failing, but good for society businesses. Well, theoretically anyway. We'll get back to that. And Leslie thinks the video dome is beneficial to the local community in some way. But then she decides to go all politician and advises the owner to spend his money more, quote, wisely so he can turn the business around financially.
So use your money wisely. Get popular films that people want to see, like Pixar. Reese Witherspoon.
You know, honestly, I think this kind of undermines her whole position. I mean, will the Video Dome even be a cultural community center or space for art if it just rents out Hollywood movies? Anyway, that's just a little pet peeve I have, and it's not actually the propaganda part. So after the sit down, they all gather at a city council meeting where Leslie makes her case to the public. The Video Dome has tremendous community value. It's a place where people, quote, gather to expand their horizons. And so she ends up pushing the landmark designation through. And 3 days later, Ron shows up alongside her outside the newly reopened Video Dome. At a glance, everything looks pretty good. There's lots of people and the business seems to be thriving once more. But then the owner explains what he did with the government money.
I took your advice, got rid of all those dusty old foreign films and used the money for the part of our business that's always done pretty well for us. Give the people what they want, right?
Turns out the Video Dome is now very clearly an adult video store. Oh no, the bailout failed. Leslie's own advice came back to bite her. The owner gave up on culture and did use his money more wisely, and it turned into Leslie's worst nightmare becoming her reality. In effect, the government now owns an adult video store. So seemingly, Leslie's attempt to maintain local culture failed. She's unhappy, but Ron was right, and he's absolutely delighted. And this finally brings me to the scene that got me to pause this episode and pick up this absolute tome of a book. Capitalism, a Global History. It's not a big deal. It's a light read for me, really. Just a few hundred very specific historical examples that debunks one of the most common narratives surrounding capitalism, a narrative that we're about to get into. A quick interruption, go hit that like button right now. That helps I can't do it without you liking the video. So please, if you're a good anti-capitalist, go like the video and comment and subscribe too. So after the opening, Leslie and Ron sit down at a restaurant and have a pretty telling conversation.
Go ahead, Ron. Let me have it. Oh, wait, I'll do it for you.
I told you so, Leslie. This is what happens when the government interferes with business. Government is bad, business is good, free market.
Caricature within a caricature.
Capitalism is the only way, Leslie. It moves our country forward. It's what makes America great. And England okay, and France terrible.
Okay, so suddenly Ron is not just a libertarian, but a capitalist too. And as we'll see, that's actually not that surprising at all.
Look, the point is, there has to be a way for the government to help places that add community value, but don't necessarily rake in the money.
So naive. I mean, why would anyone ever use money for the sake of the community?
There is not. The free market is a jungle. It's beautiful and brutal and should be left alone. When a business fails, it dies and a new, better one takes its place. Just let business be business and government be government.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is pretty much how the episode ends. We are left with the message of let business be business and government be government, and that right there, well, that's straight up fiction and a classic propaganda point. This whole conversation plays into a very common narrative that I keep hearing about capitalism, that it's somehow completely disconnected from the government or the state or what you want to call it, and it's only dictated by the whims of the free market. But let me tell you, it very much is not. In fact, the free market doesn't even exist outside of theory. Any real market we have in our world is very much dictated by states, by governments. And it's always been like that. But let's just get our definition straight, because otherwise there's really no point in discussing that big word, capitalism. Sven Beckert defines capitalism as a global economic system where the most fundamental feature is the investment of wealth to generate more wealth, aka capital. In this system, owners of capital, aka rich people or corporations, they organize the production for society. That means they decide on what literal things and services to make, not because they need those specific things or services, and not for social benefit either. No, they choose what to produce, what to spend our resources on, based on how much money they get back from that production. That also means that within capitalism, $100 billion invested in, say, healthcare is likely less valuable than $100 billion invested into tear gas. Well, unless that healthcare is privatized and can bring in profits from consumer health costs. And this logic, although it might sound counterintuitive at first, well, it's conceptually unimaginable without someone deciding on the rules, and that would be the government. You know what? I'll take it a step further. Pure free market capitalism literally does not exist. If it did, it would probably self-destruct really quickly because there'd be no resources invested into things that aren't necessarily profitable, but that make our world run, like infrastructure maintenance or public utilities or stuff like that. You see, if we actually only had so-called free markets, putting aside monopolies for now, there'd be no one to clean up the mess left by those free markets. Economists have a very fancy word for this sort of stuff. They call it the externalities of the market. It's the cost or the benefit, I guess, that isn't put into the equation of any cost-benefit analysis of how much capital an investment will bring back. That sounds very complicated, but for me it's easier to think about it like this. Say the market is like a group of roommates sharing an apartment. If there are no rules, like no cleaning rotations, no shared understanding that someone has to buy, say, dish soap, well, the economically rational move for each roommate is just to not do those things. Okay, I know that humans aren't economically rational beings, but let's just say they are, just like owners of capital pride themselves on being. In this case, why would you spend your money and time to buy dish soap and to scrub the bathroom if your roommate gets the benefit without lifting a finger? It'd be way better for you just to wait for them to crack and let them buy the dish soap instead. But of course, in this scenario, they feel the same way too, and likewise, they'd also wait for you to crack, and meanwhile, the apartment gets really gross and disgusting and eventually just uninhabitable. That's a negative externality. I should probably clean my apartment, actually. In the apartment scenario, with the so-called logical economic free market thinking, nobody actively decides to live in this degenerated apartment. It just kind of happens because that's how you, theoretically, get ahead of your roommates. And that's one of the reasons a free market would self-destruct pretty quickly. In the real world, I think climate change is about as good of an example we have of a negative externality of markets. The fossil fuel industry, for example, has known for decades about the catastrophic externality of carbon emissions, the destruction of civilization. But the rational free market response without regulation has been to continue emitting and to even actively fund climate propaganda to forestall regulation. And that's because the costs are externalized onto future generations and the global poor, while the profits are very tangible right now. And so, climate change, left purely to market logic, will basically just continue without fail until the externality becomes so severe it destabilizes human civilization itself. And in the apocalypse, we can't have markets, can we now? Now, even though governments are really bad at regulating the fossil fuel industry because it's so profitable and the consequences are so far ahead, and it mainly affects poor countries anyway, well, states have always regulated markets. If we look back throughout the history of capitalism, we see that states actually love working hand in hand with owners of capital by regulating markets. The thing is, it's just not always for our benefit. Actually, in most cases, it just isn't. From the very beginning of capitalism's history, the first markets didn't just spontaneously emerge from the logic of supply and demand. No, as Beckert makes very clear, these markets emerged because of state politics. Let's do a quick bunny hop through the last 1,000-ish years and look at a few examples. For example, in 12th century Aden, the pre-modern state made the rules of the riverbed where trade was done by providing security and regulating the marketplace. That basically made the enforcement of contracts possible. Regulated. In 1519, the German Fugger family bribed the right people to get Charles V elected as Holy Roman Emperor in exchange for exclusive access to Spain's mercury deposits. This basically gave the family a massive protected market, aka a monopoly, for their capital to grow. Regulated. In 1694, the English government re-engineered money by allowing the Bank of England, which was private back then by the way, to issue notes for government borrowing. The important bit here is that this completely aligned the interests of the state with private owners of capital who received interest payments in exchange for funding the state's military needs. State-sponsored. Actually, because early modern states needed a lot of resources for wars, and because of the old Black Death that wiped out a third of Europe's labor force, amongst other reasons, states gave exclusive and sovereign rights to private companies like the Dutch and English East India Companies to raise capital and armies. Lots of armies, state-sponsored and regulated, and the list goes on. Trust me, I've read too many examples at this point. The point is, states have always played a crucial role in the expansion of trade and markets. And as rulers everywhere became more dependent on the fortunes and whims of merchants, or, as they eventually called themselves, capitalists, states made the expansion of those very merchants possible. And it was, and still is, a great relationship for both parties. Eventually, capital owners ran on the literal roads and rails created by political rulers and received sweet interest payments from the loans given to those states. And states everywhere have always been cool with this because they can tax the profits of private venture and then use that tax money to build more public infrastructure like roads or rails, but of course also to do war, a lot of war. Beckert writes, not surprisingly, between 1670 and 1815, the British government managed to increase tax extraction by a factor of 17, even though the national income only tripled during those same years. Whoever associates capitalism with low taxation has not studied history. Over the same period, Ottoman tax revenue remained almost unchanged. So, what was it you were saying, Ron?
Just let business be business and government be government.
Not so smug now, are we? And it continues to this day. Nowadays, our economy is based less on the production of literal goods and more on financial speculation, of course, but that doesn't mean that states aren't married to capital. Remember that 2008 great economic recession thing? When the speculative loans and investments of private banks blew up in their faces? Well, right after that happened, we saw the loving relationship between capital owners and the government in action, alive and well. When all the private banks failed, the government had their backs and bailed them out. Thanks, government. And the same thing happened when Russia invaded Ukraine. With rising oil prices, instead of demanding that big oil corporations lower their profit margins, God forbid, states gave them subsidies instead. Yeah, it kept oil prices somewhat low for us consumers in the short term, but also meant that corporations made unprecedented profits during a crisis in their very own industry. And that, of course, just means more inequality between the big guns and the rest of us folk. And very likely, the same will happen with the war in Iran. This is just classic capitalism. This is really not a free market, it's a very regulated market. But unfortunately, often in the favor of owners of capital. Now, the thing about capitalist propaganda is that you have to dig really deep to debunk it, as I think is evidenced by my 10-minute ramble about the very, very brief history of markets. I even remember doing an economics course during my undergraduate degree where I was taught about the effectiveness of the invisible hand of the free market and all of that. Even in universities, we're still being fed this crap. And so I guess it's not that surprising that we hear the same talking points from Ron. As far as Park and Rec goes, I think what's probably happening here in the show is that the writers don't really understand what capitalism is. And they think because Ron is a libertarian, he should be into capitalism, which kind of makes sense. We'll get there. But I think the message actually hits pretty hard because throughout the show, Ron is always portrayed, as the level-headed, logical guy. He's the guy who builds his own chairs and knows how much a steak should cost or whatever. Sure, he's definitely a goofy caricature, but I'd say the other characters are even more absurd. And exactly because he's the level-headed guy compared to, for example, Leslie's weird and chaotic energy, his libertarian rants often come off as objective, common-sense truths rather than just one side of a historical debate. And I think that's especially true for this episode. So the propaganda here isn't really that the Videodome fails and that he was right after all. It's that the show frames Ron's "market is a jungle" speech as the logical conclusion to the episode's events. My point is that by making the most rational character in the office, the one who also preaches that the market is beautiful and brutal and should be left alone or whatever, the writer subconsciously reinforced the myth that capitalism is somehow free from evil government meddling. But as Beckert's history shows, this logic is complete fantasy. Capitalism does not operate outside of the state. No, it was very much made by the state and to this day is upheld by the state. And what I think really hammers down the nail here for me is that Ron is actually a good guy, like annoyingly so. And he doesn't even act on the very rants he goes on about with capitalism and libertarianism. We see that in another episode from the following season when his cabin is up for sale. Instead of selling it to the highest bidder, which a good capitalist very much would do, he just kind of gives it away for free to April and Andy. That's a good guy move. Definitely not a capitalist move, and not a libertarian move either. And look, the episode isn't entirely wrong that government intervention can go badly. It obviously can. But that's not actually the question we should be asking. The interesting question is which regulations and in whose favor. Because as I hope I've made clear by now, there has always been regulation. The choice has never been between a regulated market and a free one. The choice has always been between regulations that serve capital owners and regulations that serve everyone else. Like, historically, granting monopolies to private companies to outsource colonial resource extraction for the purpose of warfare, well, that is very much regulation. And likewise, deregulating the investment strategies of private banks so that they can make catastrophically speculative loans until the whole world economy collapses and the government has to apply regulations to bail them out, that's also regulation, as weird as that sounds. Just the kind that benefits the people at the top and sends the bill to everyone else. And no doubt that it's going to happen with the oil industry again with the war in Iran. Can we just stop subsidizing big oil, please? I mean, apart from the bad economics, maybe this might be a good opportunity to start thinking more seriously about subsidizing a clean, green energy transition. I know it's not as profitable, but neither is the end of civilization. But then on the other hand, things like wealth taxes, antitrust laws, welfare systems, labor protections, well, these are also regulations of the market, but they're the good kind, in my opinion anyway. I'd say that these are the regulations that have actually kept our societies from completely degenerating into a libertarian, or shall I say capitalist, wet but dystopian dream. Now, last thing I want to say, which might be the elephant in the room here, you might be confused that I'm using capitalism and libertarianism interchangeably all the time here. Ron is more of a libertarian than a capitalist, right? I mean, that's his whole thing. Well, as it turns out, these days, the two ideologies are just remarkably similar. So think about it like this. Let's imagine there were no rules, like libertarians want, right? Let's say that there are no rules for where you should be driving on the road, left or right. It does not matter. So in this scenario, anyone can drive where they want. At a glance, it looks like freedom. But what actually ends up happening is that the person with the biggest truck pretty quickly finds out that they don't need to share the road with anyone else. They can just drive straight through. And so, sure, technically everyone has the same freedom to drive wherever they want, but that freedom means something completely different if you're driving a Toyota Aygo versus an 18-wheeler. Eventually, the big trucks will consolidate the best routes, and the Aygo is left with the ditch. Sorry, Toyota. If you think about libertarianism like that, well, we don't really get freedom. We're actually just handing freedom over to whoever already owns the biggest truck. That's libertarianism for you. For us regular folk, the only free choice we're left with is either to sell our time as labor or the freedom to starve. And that's exactly what's happened over the last 40-odd years of neoliberal deregulation. also synonymous with libertarianism. Inequality is at historic highs. The environment is fucked. And the regulations we've gotten rid of were mostly the ones protecting us people, while the ones protecting owners of capital have stayed firmly in place. So, when Ron says,
just let business be business and government be government,
it sounds good, it sounds clean and logical, and coming from him, like something a sensible guy would say. But it describes a world that literally has never existed, and if it did, it just would not last very long. Okay, I think that's enough ranting about capitalism for today. If you've become depressed during my talk here today, I recommend logging off the internet for a while and, go spend some time with real people who, just like Ron, usually are a lot kinder than what they claim to believe in. Also, you can support me. You can support these rants I do on my Patreon, where we also have a community Discord server. I really hope to see you there, and thank you so much to all my wonderful supporters there. A special shout out goes to Flacky, thank you so much, and to Emperor Vias, and to Louis Rebillard. Thank you very much for your time, and goodbye. And like this video, comment, and subscribe, please. Otherwise, I can't keep going.